Comrades, you're all very welcome to this meeting of WIN, Works International Network. Today, we're having a discussion about Scotland, and our two speakers are Matthew and Ian. Starting with Ian. There's been many developments in Scotland in the last decade or so, starting off with the referendum and devolution, then the referendum and independence, and the crisis in the Scottish Nationalist Party. More recently, the gains being made by Labour at the expense of the Scottish National Party. We can also reflect on the disastrous intervention by Ed Miliband and Gordon Brown during the referendum, where they formed a common front with the Tory party against independence. So whatever about the arguments for and against, a yes or a no vote, forming a common front with the Tories was a disaster for Labour, and they paid dearly for that. So the discussion is going to be a broad discussion about Scotland and the issues as they are emerging. So Ian is going to start the discussion. So I'll introduce Ian as our first speaker.
Hi, thanks for having me. And it was going to be the other way around, with Matthew leading off about the kind of long historical class background to all this and me bringing things right up to date. So apologies, things might be a little back to front. But just to start with my kind of conclusion first, a kind of thesis, is that what I've been saying for the last year or so is that Scottish politics has rejoined UK politics for the first time really since the referendum of late. And I think that was really made clear by the general election result that was already becoming clear in the run-up. But it's done so at obviously one of the worst possible times for British politics itself, with the establishment having seemingly closed down both whatever challenge, and we can talk about what kind of a genuine challenge it really was or not, was posed by independence, but also having closed down British politics and much more healthy and, in my view, challenge of Corbynism and the revival of socialism. So, yeah, it's quite bleak landscape in some ways, as well as a kind of Pyrrhic victory for those of us who are raising the standard of Corbyn and engagement with all British politics and an attempt to change things across the UK and to stand up for workers across the UK as an alternative to independence. And a few months after, probably none of us expected how quickly that would turn into something really concrete and material with the explosion of Corbynism out of the blue in the Labour Party. I think it's the Labour Party in the crisis of Scottish Labour, but also of Labour more widely, that we can locate independence really coming from as a live issue in Scotland. The SNP had been building for a long time, from fringe status in the 1960s to the main opposition in the Scottish Parliament. But it was really Blairism, the Iraq War, Alex Salmond especially at that time, on a sabbatical from leading the SNP, took a particularly good combative position on the Iraq War, trying to impeach Tony Blair, for one thing, when he was leading the SNP at Westminster. The fact that the Scottish Parliament under Blairite leadership did nothing to challenge the UK Blairite government, quite different dynamic from Wales, where they put, in Mark Drakeford's words, clear red water between Labour Wales, which is still Labour Wales, and Blairite Westminster. Whereas with Jack McConnell, the First Minister for all but the first couple of years of devolution under Labour, it was much more kind of Blairite neoliberal tier of local government, and all the big guns in Scottish politics still went to Westminster. So when the SNP came in first, minority government, 1 seat advantage over Labour, they were able to appear as more radical than Labour had been, Alex Salmond had positioned them to the left of Labour, which was easier to do in the Blair years than previously, or than under Corbyn, though that's changing back obviously now again. And for the first term, they didn't really have any possibility of moving forward on independence itself because they didn't have a majority. But in terms of both seeming effectiveness and pragmatism and delivery, and in being more radical, they were better than Labour had been, and better than they were to become latterly. During the independence referendum itself, they jettisoned most of their radical politics. Alex Salmond said later on during his time leading Alba that he regretted letting himself be persuaded by Angus Robertson to change the SNP's historic opposition to NATO. They said that we'd keep the Queen as head of state. I know some people who were pro-independence before, and actually some who became pro-independence again after, but voted against it at the referendum. He said that a republic could have changed their mind. The thing about keeping the pound as the currency, but also wanting to be in the European Union. So all the things where independence could have been a change were actually jettisoned. That was to make it less scary, I suppose, from a conservative small c point of view. But for people like us, it actually robbed it of any kind of positive aspect that it could have had, and all that was left was the messy divorce, plonking an international border down the middle of this island with working people on either side whose interests were the same against bosses on either side who had a lot more in common with worker in, Glasgow and Bradford than with Brian Souter, one of the SNP's main backers, Scotland's richest homophobe, as he was often described. So, yeah, the independence didn't add up. It didn't add up financially. Questions about keeping the pound, about the startup costs of a new nation, things that really might be doable when it's a government, when there's no reason to do it, and it's a government that's made clear its commitment to capitalism and keeping things as status quo as possible in every other way. Then, of course, working people would have been made to pay the price for it. The burden would have fallen on them. So that the case was so wide. I can't remember who said it. If it was George Galloway or one of my other comrades in that referendum campaign. The case was so wide that you could drive a bus through it. But in the last literally month to even fortnight of the campaign, there was a late surge for independence. Some of the credit could, I suppose, go to there was a lot of work done, possibly wrong-headedly, but there was a lot of work done by most of the radical left in Scotland on the council estates, building support for independence as a protest vote against David Cameron's austerity programme. That was the main aspect of British politics at that time. But also, as the chair's already indicated, the disastrous decision of Labour and the Tories to campaign together, Better Together, it was called. Now, I believe that working people in Scotland and England are better together. I certainly don't believe that Labour and the Tories are better together. And to blur those lines was really disastrous. I know, for example, there was one debate between Alex Salmond and Alistair Darling, now strangely 10 years later, both dead, but the leaders of the two campaigns, where Darling, for no surprisingly, won, because he wasn't as charismatic a figure as Alex Salmond. But Salmond was completely tongue-tied, went off in lots of different tangents and couldn't answer the key question about the currency. At that point, Darling could have called it quits, but there were going to be 3 debates. Darling said, okay, we'll do one more. And it was a few weeks before the vote. And Salmond came back fighting. Darling was a disaster. And just those kind of things had a real effect by that stage. There was a story Salmon told on one of the documentaries soon after the campaign that he got a text. It's 51:49, and he was off playing golf, and he turned his phone off, and then he turned it back on, and it was like he'd got 50 messages, and he thought it was 51:49 for no, and he was happy about that. He thought that means we've got time to build, to kind of get the first 51:49 in our favour on election day. But it was actually 51:49 in his favour, and he thought, oh no, now we'll throw the kitchen sink at it. So one of my key problems with all that kind of thing was, if you've got to sneak past a vote in favour of your own country's independence on a 50% plus one persuasion of your own people at a certain point in time, and hopefully the first point in time to avoid the other side campaigning too hard themselves, it's totally different situation from decolonization. Let's get that straight. You weren't going to get 50% plus one Jamaicans or Ghanaians voting to remain within the British Empire, where they were never part of Britain, those countries, in that way. I think it's also a completely different situation from Ireland. Certainly the situation in Ireland now, where Ireland itself is partitioned, and the question of Irish reunification as opposed to Scottish separation, but also with the whole history. There's never been colonisation, armed campaigns of pacification in Scotland. The two ruling classes came together. Matthew might talk more about these things. I thought it was briefly worth touching on for people who might think of Scottish independence as being necessarily part of that same liberation tradition. There were obviously arguments about breaking the British state, but as I say, the way the SNP moulded independence in a very conservative way meant that any kind of additional benefits of independence from a left perspective would be hard to grasp. And their whole thing was independence as an end in itself, or I prefer to call it independence just because, to kind of draw out the playground nature of it. One of the pro-independence figures on BBC Question Time once said, it's not about anything else, it's just about being a normal country. And what is a normal country in today's world? It's cookie cutter countries that are all controlled by globalization, big business, and imperialism. That's not to say if you're nationally oppressed or colonized, you shouldn't struggle to change that, but just to bring back an ancient country for no other reason. Yeah, so the SNP's conservatism, but there was a protest vote against austerity. And the fact that it came so late in the day, it did sort of leave both the SNP and their opposition in a bit of a dilemma after the vote, which was for no. But the very morning after, the Tories, who Labour had got into bed with, stabbed Labour in the back. Cameron made his English nationalist speech, brought in his EVEL plot. That's not a value judgment. Stands for English votes for evil, for English votes for English laws. EVEL, and all this talk of, if you vote no, there'll be federalism, there'll be devolution max. Instead, there was that from the Tories, and they ran a frankly anti-Scottish at times campaign in England, as well as obviously screwing over the Liberal Democrats who'd been their coalition partners and patsies and won a surprise second term. So all of these things turbocharged the idea that although Scotland had voted no fair and square, that we'd been robbed, that the momentum that was built at the very tail end of the election, of the referendum, carried on. But at the same time, Scotland had voted no, and the idea that we declare independence on the basis of the people voting against it was even worse than the idea that we have to persuade 50% plus one time of their own independence, which no truly oppressed people would have to be persuaded of in the first place. That yeah, so basically what came after that was the Nicola Sturgeon era, which has taken up most of the time since. And I describe it as a hamster wheel. I think George Galloway described it as that, but I think that's something that Alex Salmond would have agreed with. I think coming at it from opposite ends of the constitutional question, both of those figures, also Craig Murray on the Alex Salmond pro-independence side, but who stood on the same slate as George Galloway in the latest election over Gaza. They both see what Sturgeon did as a hamster wheel. The way I describe it is there was always going to be an Indy Ref 2 next year, but never this year. And so it was future faking, basically, to use the kind of jargon from relationships and so on. She was future faking the country. And it was a way of responding to this dilemma that the SNP were in, that there was a mass movement for independence. It wasn't mass in the sense of being 55, 60, 70% of the population. It hovered around half. It's usually a little under half, occasionally spiked to over. Yeah, so the Sturgeon kind of ascendancy lasted a long time on that basis. It was always bound to eventually be derailed, and eventually it was last year. It could have been a few years earlier, the Alex Salmond case. For those of us who remember the Scottish Socialist Party, shades of the Tommy Sheridan collapse, that it was incredibly lucky for Sturgeon that, as I remember hearing, walking up the Royal Mile past the court where the Salmond case was taking place, cameraman waiting to record the result, saying this would usually be the biggest story to his mate, not on the telly. I just overheard this. This would usually be the biggest story, but now we've been spiked for a literal zombie apocalypse because it was in March 2020. So that could have blown the SNP wide open a full year before the election of 2021 for the Scottish Parliament. Instead, what we had was a year of Nicola Sturgeon handling COVID, actually in policy terms, pretty much in lockstep with the UK government. But in terms of presentation, in terms of clarity, real or affected empathy, much better than Boris Johnson, which isn't a very high bar. And at a time when free movement to Europe or England, never mind that, there was no free movement from Edinburgh to Glasgow at various points in that year. The idea of independence really spiked. There was protests, go back the F to England at the border, at the train station, from nationalists on the issue of, it's about a COVID regulation, but obviously this was the pretty ugly side of nationalism coming out. That was the fringe, to be fair, but there was the feeling that Scotland was doing better. Sturgeon was proving better than Johnson. I suppose it also came straight after Brexit and straight after the collapse of Corbynism, a huge majority for the Tories, Starmer taking over a Labour Party. So it was almost a perfect storm for pro-independence, and it did drive it up above 50% for some time. Now, I think in hindsight, the idea that we could have just become independent because of that, without really wanting to, was possibly too much of a worry on the unionist side. Likewise, I wouldn't go as far as Craig Murray in saying that Nicola Sturgeon was actually a crypto anti-independence campaigner or a unionist. I think there was an element of what he says that's true, liking being a colonial administrator, minus some of the kind of nationalist assumptions around that. I think she definitely liked her position in Holyrood, but I think she remained pro-independence, and it was sort of a game of constitutional Russian roulette for the unionist side, whereas for the nationalist side, the actual ability to achieve independence was still very constrained because it was built on sand. Questions of who the government of the day was, who the opposition of the day was, who's popular, who's not popular, really mattered in a way that if it was a clear national demand that a clear majority of the nation had for an extended length of time, shouldn't matter. So it was this kind of epiphenomenon of like the crisis of British politics. For example, when Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, there was a revival of Labour in Scotland. Not as great as the one now, sadly. But in the 2017 election, Labour recaptured several seats, got some good left-wing MPs elected among them. And later that year, Richard Leonard became leader of the Scottish Labour Party, the first, so far the last left-wing leader of Scottish Labour since devolution, supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. Anna Sarwar, his opponent when Jeremy Corbyn was up straight after 2017, made the point, if you voted for independence for change to get rid of austerity, there's now the real prospect of an easier but also more radical route to real change through getting a Corbyn government. And I said, that's right. Anna Sarwar says that. And it's a great reason why you should vote for Richard Leonard rather than him for leader of the Scottish Labour Party. And the majority of electors in that contest agreed. Unfortunately, Annas never really stopped campaigning for a leadership. And 4 years later, Richard got effectively sacked by the donors when Starmer was leader, and never got the chance to get out of the parliamentary bubble onto the campaign trail of a general election. Annas having been brought in second time lucky a few months before that, and it was then greeted by the Labour right as a victory that we only went down by one MP, one seat. I think if we'd gone down already being on third place under a left-wing leader, it might not have been greeted as a victory, but how well we would have done by now, that's a hypothetical, but I think that's pretty clear at least. So we've now got a right-wing Labour leadership in Scotland. It's distanced itself occasionally on some of the most egregious kid starver stuff from Keir Starmer on the 2-child benefit limit. But it's basically a Starmeroid leadership. The SNP, when Sturgeon eventually left, this kind of hamster wheel that we were worried about, and I think there was some real basis for unity between George Galloway on the one hand and Craig Murray and Alex Salmond on the other. On none of us like it. We might want to get off in different directions constitutionally, but we do want to get on with real politics. And certainly for Galloway and Murray, and to an extent on some things, foreign policy and the like, Salmond, real radical politics. That hamster wheel fell down. And by that time, Sturgeon had become, well, she was seen as to the left of Salmond when she first came in. Someone from a grittier working class background in the grittier working class constituency. She took the SNP much further to the right. She said she got involved in CND before the SNP, but by the end she was retweeting Henry Kissinger, posing for selfies with Alistair Campbell on the anti-Brexit demos. And Brexit was one of the other constitutional layers, of course, that kept this whole thing going for longer, and maybe limited Corbynisms cut through at that time when all three were in the mix, posing for selfies with Campbell, and one of the real causes of our spectacular fallout with Alex Salmond was that he took a job with Russia Today after he lost his seat as an MP and set up his talk show, and apparently took the pitch to a few different broadcast channels, Russia Today. were the ones that took it up. So he worked with them until the Ukraine war, and left them pretty much as soon as that started, before it became actually illegal to work on Russia Today. So that level of adjacency to Russia, even years before the Ukraine war broke out, was enough for Sturgeon to be apparently really, really angry at her mentor. And I think one of the real models for an SNP style independent Scotland that I've found particularly worrying way back in the referendum itself would be a Balkan or Baltic style cookie cutter state that kind of emerged almost by accident from the collapse of bigger countries, federal countries, multinational countries. Doesn't have to be a bloodbath like Yugoslavia. That was the worst example, but even the best in Czechoslovakia of a velvet divorce seems pretty unnecessary, though ironically in Slovakia, the Prime Minister now is actually one of the least pro-Western of that lot, and might be the reason that he faced an assassination attempt recently, but that's, I digress.
Actually, Ian, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You've been talking for about 20 minutes, so could you kind of bear that in mind?
All right, I'll just quickly wrap up then on what
No, you can continue to finish the point you want to make, just to remind you about the time. You know.
Aye, cool. Yeah. Yeah. So as I say, Sturgeon's SNP on certainly issues of war and peace was much less radical than Salmon's, let alone Salmon's breakaway Alba party. There was a bit of a degradation of Scotland's traditional strong public sector. So actually making us, in a sense, less ready for independence. Again, that's the basis of unity, in my view, between nationalists and unionists, that at least if we were to be independent, we should have the capacity, which is actually being run down by the SNP. The hamster wheel also, I think, led to some of the financial scandals, as opposed to more common or garden corruption, but fundraising for a referendum that never happens, and then a party really needs the money, so where does it go? So those kind of things all came to a head, as I say, delayed by COVID. But by 2023, Sturgeon, sort of out of the blue, resigned. And in the ensuing leadership contest, the whole thing started to come crashing down. Very briefly, since I've gone on too long, Humza Yousaf was the leader of the SNP for a year. I didn't expect anything from him because he was Continuity Sturgeon, which by the time that he won, I was surprised that Continuity Sturgeon had even won. But he actually was very good on Gaza. He had family there initially. His parents-in-law were trapped when the war broke out. He did come out of the anti-Iraq war movement in 2003. And I think, I don't have any evidence or know what the exact mechanism would have been, but the fact that he turned out to be in so briefly and left office after a pretty farcical dispute with the Greens, which I'd have described in more detail if I had more time, but if you like to ask, I could describe it in Q&A, or Matthew could. I think he may not have had as much institutional support as another leader at that level, because he was good on Gaza, but I don't know the details. And now we've got John Swinney, who's taking the SNP, if anything, even further to the right, and 20 years ago was leader of the opposition and led them to their worst results since devolution. So we've got the SNP in government for 19 years, led by maybe its weakest leader in that time. Got Labour, who have there been when Humza went, there was talk of a emergency or special Scottish parliamentary election because we're votes of no confidence going around. If we'd had that election at that time, I think Anna Sarwar could have become the first minister. Labour could have won, but that was before July. Now we've got honeymoon from hell for Starmer. So they'll be an unpopular government, even more so in 2 years' time. The Tories, I don't think they can possibly win in Scotland. Again, they have had a very effective leader. They now don't do. I think there's a real possibility for, if we can bring up what's starting to happen down south in the left, they're coming together. Obviously, if Jeremy Corbyn put the call out for a united left party, that would be a real step forward. but in as a proportional representation election in Scotland, it won't be get a third of the vote and 2/3 of the seats like what happened in the almost random number generator of the fractured election at Westminster. And as I say, with 2, 3, if you count the Tories very recently at Westminster, unpopular governments contesting against each other, I think there'd be a real chance for a left intervention if by that stage there's a left party UK-wide worth talking about. There might obviously also be left nationalist interventions, but I think in terms of what I'd be hoping for and trying to work for, I think if we could bring up some of the independent, but hopefully moving beyond independent victories that happened at Westminster, and the too slow, too fragmented, hopefully moving in starting to come to some kind of coherence post Corbyn extra Labour left, I think, in the Scottish system, and with the level of the opposition that it would have, I'd imagine it would have some chance of success, but we'll see what happens. I'm kind of rushing through the last couple of points for reasons of time, but please ask any questions after, or Matthew might cover it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ian, for making the opening contribution, which you hadn't been expecting to make. So we thank you for that, for an informative and wide-ranging discussion. There's plenty of material to come back to. Our next speaker is Matthew Jones. Welcome to the meeting, Matthew.
Yeah, sorry, comrades.
We understand, but how much time do you think you might need, Matthew?
Well, I was going to do like a thing on a sort of background. So I'm going to probably be able to get through in about 10 minutes or so. You know, basically, I was going to do this as a sort of introduction. You know, so yeah, about 10 minutes. I think, you know, obviously, because we need to give time for people to contribute. And
okay, go ahead then, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of factors I thought are important in terms of understanding politics in Scotland, you know, and in sort of a reasonable sort of order. First one I would pick out would be sectarianism, which has an impact on the working class in particular, over particularly the central belt of Scotland. I mean, it used to be religious sectarianism, and now it's sort of more political sectarianism. It does have an effect, you know, and it does split the working class, and it does, you know, you can clearly see that, you know, historically, of course, it tended to move the working class toward that, you know, particularly obviously the Protestant or loyalist working class towards Toryism. And now, of course, it tends to move. It's now anti-nationalist, whereas, you know, so you've got that's still there, and of course also of course it tends to give an opening to the far right, although that's being controlled. But it is very clear, I mean, throughout, as I say, the central belt of Scotland in particular, that actually has an impact across the whole you know, of the working class. I mean, it's not, you know, we don't have peace walls or any of that sort of stuff. There's, you know, people endure, you know, the sort of having to live together and all the rest of it. It's not that bad, but it does have a political expression, you know, in those terms. I think secondly, the other thing that really also informs Scotland is its deindustrialisation. You have to remember that Scotland, of course, was basically an industrial country until about 1980. And the impact of Thatcherism is to strip out, you know, whole areas of industry, you know, and the failure of the left and the trade unions to oppose that, you know, through a whole period, and you know, really takes out entire industries: steel, coal, vehicle manufacture, you know. Even like the thing that they put in to try and replace all this stuff, that what was called Silicon Glen, all that's gone as well. So in fact, what you now see is this sort of, you know, a whole series of areas and towns that are just sort of got spaces in the middle of them because they used to have industrial plants in some cases, very large ones. You know, that has a real effect. And as I say, what happened was that the unions basically then agreed all those closures, and particularly actually the Communist Party. The Communist Party agreed to the closure of, I mean, the Scottish NUM, for instance, the Mine Workers Union, basically agreed to closures. That's what they want. That they did. They didn't want the strike in '84. They were quite happy to sign for closure. You know, they were provoked. I mean, the NCB attempted to provoke the miners' strike in Scotland first, but the NUM just kept signing to close pits. And that was the same process for shipbuilding, actually. The Communist Party agreed to the closure of, because they dominated the combine and so on, shipbuilding and engineering, and they signed for closure. Even in the case, I mean, the one case, actually, the one major plant, which was run, actually, the convener was a member of the SWP at Linwood, the car plant, because there were two major vehicle plants in Scotland, one at Linwood and one at Bathgate. And the one at Linwood, of course, historically was run, you know, had the influence by IS, and they actually had the guy who was a convener, who was, you know, in the SWP at the time in 1980, and even they were not able to oppose that. So essentially, what you got was a destruction of that organisation of the working class, and of course the left. The left was either going along with that, or was impotent to prevent it or struggle against it. There were odd struggles against closure and so on. These were odd plans, but nothing of any size or duration. So that really has an effect in terms of the confidence of the class itself and in terms of its actual organisation. So, I mean, you see it sort of shattered and atomized. And if you go, I mean, the thing is, you've now got a generation of youth in Scotland, most of whom don't understand collective action. You know, because they've never seen it. They've never really seen it, you know, and you know, it's quite strange to talk to people. So, you know, in that sense, that's had a real impact across, you know, the whole basis of the working class and so on. I think there's other things, and you know, in terms of, you know, because I'll try and be brief from, there's other things like the growth of the oil industry and so forth, which I think is important. I mean, both in terms of its impact on the working class and the fact that, you know, I mean, the impact for the working class obviously was to prop up heavy industry, and people were then able to go and work, you know, who'd been sacked out of the shipyards and so on and so forth, were able to go and work in you know, rig fabrication across Scotland in different places like Nig Bay and Ardisty, in Hunterston, and they converted the big yard at John Brown's yard in Clydebank to rig fabrication and so on and so forth. So it prolonged that. But in terms of the impact for the working class, obviously the jobs in the North Sea itself were better paid than what you got onshore, but they were extremely dangerous, and B, it was extremely difficult to organise the unions. You know, I mean, the thing is that the impact on the working class has been that it's taken at least 30 years or more for the unions to get onto the rigs. They are now, but you know, it took a long fight. And of course, the level of both wages and safety in the British sector of the North Sea are far worse than, say, in Norway. In the Norwegian sector, just across the, you know, literally bordering it. You know, so I mean, British helicopters drop out of the sky and have done on a regular basis because they can't be asked to maintain them. Rigs blew up, rigs turned over, so on and so forth. You know, and it was like that. Politically, of course, oil is different because obviously politically, then oil gave the sort of revenue that was, you know, both fueled Thatcherism actually, because it was able to pay. Thatcherism was able to pay off the working class using the revenue from oil. But also nationalism. Of course, nationalism then said, well, you know, this revenue is coming in, we should have it, and all this, it's our oil, all that sort of thing, all political question there. So oil has a political impact and a class impact. And I think the final point I want to make, and I'll not go into the poll tax, which I think is important, but I haven't got time. I think the final point I make is the collapse of the political collapse of the left, which is extremely important, and I think promotes actually has given cover and promoted the SNP. Actually, what's happened is that the left itself traditionally was anti-nationalist, you know, and you can go through the whole thing. And in fact, what happened from the early 90s onwards, Tommy Sheridan and Alan Coombs and so on and so forth personally convinced Peter Taft that they should move everything towards nationalism. Well, there was never a discussion in the organisation at the time, which is extraordinary. You know, you do a 180 and there's no discussion. You know, suddenly, you know, you've had a history of arguing against this thing, and suddenly you do a 180 and nobody says anything. So, you know, in those terms, it's then the left. and it's a progressive collapse. You know, and you can go through all the organisations. It goes through that Socialist Party element, you know, which then of course splits off. You know, the Scottish part splits off, as you know. There's a rump of people as well that are left, and Sheridan and McCombs and so on and so forth go and split off to form the core of the SSP. I go to the SSP. I was a branch organiser on the SSP, which is interesting. I can go through that if people want to talk about the SSP. It's, you know, and that goes through, you know, so you get the SWP collapses into nationalism. Actually, the one that's really funny, of course, is the Socialist Appeal, which had took in my view, the right position through the referendum of opposing voting no. As soon as the referendum was over, they suddenly turned around and said, well, no, we're in favour of nationalism. And of course, they didn't actually consult anybody in Scotland about this. They just came out, Woods and Company just came out with this view. And most of the people in Scotland just were like, okay, we're off then. If you want to, you know, you want to make that kind of decision, you know, without even consulting us, we'll just go, you know, so they did. Which is entirely real, but it's a political thing, you know. I mean, it is actually, you know, I mean, if you're a socialist, is it actually the case that the creation of a new capitalist state actually gives any solution for the working class? You know, this is fundamental to Marxism. You know, Marx talks about the working class being the solution, and it doesn't talk about the creation of new states. And again, Trotsky. I mean, obviously, with permanent revolution. I mean, when he talks in 1905, he said, well, the capitalist class can offer nothing. You know, has nothing to offer, and quite clearly, I mean, that, you know, quite clearly that is the case. But it's that collapse. Actually, the important thing is that collapse then feeds the growth of the SNP, because it's then the left. It's actually the far left in particular that is then going out and recruiting people for the SNP. This is the growth of the SNP. In many ways, in the working class, is actually facilitated by that collapse. So, in that sense, I mean, it's important in terms of its impact on the politics of the working class itself. That, you know, obviously the left doesn't grow, because obviously why would you join some little sect if you can just go and join, you know, a substantial party instead? And again, I mean, what you've seen obviously is with as Ian has outlined, you know, the whole crisis of the SNP is what, you know, the growth of the SNP's membership, and it's fading, and that's what's happening now. Of course, it's loss of huge amount, tens of thousands of members, and of course, it's loss of votes, as people obviously recognise the fact that it's not actually capable of delivering anything, and doesn't want to, merely operates as neoliberal. So, I mean, I'll leave it there, and I hope that people want to raise issues and so on and so forth, and go into any particular aspect that people want to do. Okay, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, for your contribution there. It'll add considerably to when the discussion takes off. So now, if comrades wish to speak, you can indicate on the electronic button, raise your hand, or I can see all the comrades on the screen. So if you're happy to just wave your hand around, that's okay. So who wants to speak in the discussion now? And there's a wide range of issues have been raised by both Matthew and Ian. And comrades can come back on the issues to develop them further if they so choose. So anybody who wishes to speak now, just indicate. There's a number of questions. The collapse of industry, steel making. Like in 1913, Scotland was a world leader in some of these areas. The industries disappeared, creating mass unemployment and poverty. It's one of the issues that Match brought up there. We could develop that. And then the question of the stance that was taken on the referendum, and the reason why the nationalists gained, and the failures of the Labour Party and the Labour movement generally to resolve the problems that workers faced. So there's quite a range of issues there that comrades can develop if they so choose. So I'm still waiting for hand waving or electronic indicators. It's not characteristic of our meetings to have reticence and shyness. So, in the absence of speakers, Matthew, you want to make some additional points there?
Yeah, I think the other thing you have to bear in mind, actually, there's a couple of, in terms of the Labour Party in Scotland, is that the Labour Party, of course, historically is one Catholic party. Certainly in the west of Scotland, which is its core, which does make life quite interesting, because obviously what happened, of course, is that the Labour Party was forever trying to expand beyond this. So in some cases they would make appeals to the Orange Lodge, and this continues actually up down to the present day. They contact the leaders of certain Orange Lodges in certain areas and say, can you get your guys to vote for us? And they would appear with Rangers scarves and so on and so forth, in effort to trying to convince the loyalist working class to vote for them. But the thing is that in Glasgow in particular, of course, the Labour Party's never been a particularly mass organisation. Actually, the Communist Party was far bigger than the Labour Party over most of the history, from the 20s onwards, as you might expect. So it's very odd in those terms. And the other thing, of course, is that now it's actually run by a businessman. Anas Sarwar is a businessman. He has a warehouse. He runs a wholesale warehouse business. So he's actually, he's a bona fide capitalist. And its main sponsor is a guy called Willie Hockey, who's a significant business operative in Glasgow. And okay, it does have affiliations with the unions, but its actual Scottish manifesto was launched by Starmer in Willie Hockey's big site in Glasgow, behind a line of cops and a line of security guards to make sure that the unwashed couldn't get near him. So that's the kind of operation we're looking at this point. Sorry, thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Comrades, I wish to speak about the rich Labour traditions in Scotland, which go way back. The Labour Party first MP was Keir Hardie, Scottish MP, and it's worth noting, I think his family should take a court injunction against Keir Starmer for using the name Keir, which he says was borrowed from Keir Hardie. And then there was the Clydeside Rebellion in the post-World War I period. There was the Clydeside shipbuilders occupation, which received enormous attention in the early 70s. It's a miners' strike, very significant in Scotland. So a very, very rich tradition. And as I say, historic figures like John McLean as well, that go way back into Scottish socialist history. So there's a range of issues which both Matthew and Ian have raised, which comrades are welcome to.
Could
Ian wants to come back. Go ahead.
Respond to something Matthew said. I was thinking of when he mentioned deindustrialization, that I think a lot of the things that I described in terms of more recent machinations of Labour in the SNP kind of have that at its root, because, as I said, the rise of the SNP and then of independence as an idea that took hold in a section of the population as a way out is from the crisis of Scottish Labour, which had been the hegemonic party in the country, or as in British terms, in this industrial part of the wider UK country. And I think Scotland's uncanny tradition of producing political talent came from that strong Labour movement tradition. Obviously, some people like, say, Alex Salmond might not have come out of that directly, but and even he wasn't from like a Highland Laird background. He was from a working class council estate in Linlithgow, but in terms of his political trajectory and so on, obviously not directly out of the Labour movement. But yeah, the Scottish Labour MPs, first of all, the really talented ones stayed at Westminster, and Scottish Parliament was sort of like a council, but also the evolution had been, unlike independence, a very long-term demand for home rule in Scotland, and had it been achieved as it almost was in 1979, just before Margaret Thatcher came in with SNP votes, bringing down the Labour government at an inopportune time for it to get re-elected, which is actually one of the reasons Margaret Thatcher came in, and was commented on in the referendum as part of their history that wasn't so great. If that Parliament had come in, it would have been a totally different era. The struggles of the 80s, if we remember the so-called loony left councils, Ken Livingstone, Liverpool under the militant, of course, that if Scotland, with a devolved Parliament and government was part of that, it wouldn't have led immediately to, and in my opinion, the UK's total basket case. It would have been able to link up with those things in a further challenge to Thatcherism if Thatcher had even come in, as I say. But yeah, by the time we got the Parliament, deindustrialisation, I see Matthew's just said there were no left-wing councils in Scotland in the 80s. That's a good point. But I think a devolved Scottish Parliament under Thatcher and fighting her would have been a totally different origin story from 8 years of marching in lockstep with Tony Blair. And so the Labour Party, New Labour, kind of deindustrialisation of the Labour Party, as it were, turning its back on its whole working class heritage. Blair saying that it was a mistake to split from the Liberals. That dovetailed with the deindustrialisation of Scotland to create a very managerial kind of politics that, in a way, the election of the SNP in 2007 was a reaction against, even though under Sturgeon it kind of reached new levels of incompetence, not able to deliver the ferries that they were building, and so on. Come the Sturgeon and Salmond testimonies in 2021 on the Salmond case and how it had been handled the year before. I think one SNP MSP boasted that that in Holyrood they didn't have parliamentary privilege in order to disclose redacted details the way a Westminster MP could. And it somehow saw this as a good thing. So this kind of peak neoliberal impotence of the Scottish Parliament was really something to behold. And I think what's unfortunate in this latest election with Starmer, where I think Labour's quality controlled, i.e. heavily purged slate has got in by default, is that Scotland's uncanny knack for producing political talent in the days before pre-industrialisation has continued its long slide. You had the SNP who got elected in 2015 to the UK Parliament. Some of them were actually quite interesting people. Tommy Shepherd, until a few months ago, my MP, was the Deputy General Secretary of Scottish Labour before he said, the party under Blair, I didn't leave it, it left me. And he's a comedy promoter, and he's also was one of the best MPs on Palestine. And there were a few other left-wingers in that SNP intake. Was less vetted than at Holyrood in some ways. Then there was the Corbyn minor resurgence in 2017 that did produce some good left-wingers. Even 2019, when the SNP came back in the Brexit election, produced a couple of people who ended up defecting to Alba, including Neil Hanvey, member of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I don't know of any. Maybe someone will emerge halfway through the Parliament. I think it's going to be a pretty bland automaton slate if Starmer gets his way, at least. And certainly things are all coming up Starmer on the electoral front for this very limited period, with 34% getting you 64% of the seats. So I think that kind of thing in the Scottish psyche, hopefully there'll be a real reaction against in a couple of years, and that the idea of representatives of independent mind and tied to the sort of revival of trade unionism that is also happening to an extent at the grassroots could be the kind of alternative that we need, because these two things that have gone wrong, the totally bland, boring aspect of politics and its kind of delinking from ordinary people, is kind of what both the neoliberal Labour in the Jack McConnell, Tony Blair period, and now Starmer Sarwar stand for, and what certainly the Sturgeon clique and its backbench at Holyrood was increasingly standing for. And as I say, both will be unpopular governments, even if there was an election tomorrow, let alone in a couple of years' time. So yeah, that's sort of a long-winded response to the thing about deindustrialization. I think it's always been commented on UK-wide how Scotland has produced more than its fair share of political talent. I think the fact that it was a very industrial area with a strong labour movement was the main part of it, and that a lot of the symptoms of nationalism, but also of just degradation, as I say that comment, it's great that we don't have the power to hold people to account, said in all earnestness, is part of that. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
Yeah, thank you.
I also meant to talk about the Greens. If someone once asked me about the Greens.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. Trish, do you want to develop that point in a spoken contribution there about the left wing? Yeah, okay. I just saw in the chat, it sounded a very interesting point you're making there. So does anybody want to make a contribution at this stage? Or raise a question? Yeah, Trish, go ahead.
Yeah, go on then. Thanks. I was really interested in this today. I was really pleased to hear from both Ian and Matthew. Thank you. My knowledge on the politics in Scotland is minuscule. I mean, my daughter lives there. She's nearly been there 10 years. So I go up frequently. And I've got to say the people I'm in Scotland really quite regularly. I think the people I mostly mix with in Scotland, they're either my daughter's age and young and mostly just caught up in identity politics to the point of absolute what feels like a merry-go-round, which I really struggle with a bit. You know, everybody's a misogynist now, including Jermaine Greer. Once someone says that to me, they've lost me. You know, so yeah, you know, there's a lot of young people who seem to be in a cul-de-sac of nonsense that they've been almost sent into by some bizarre turn of fate. I don't know, but generally speaking, the sort of more grown-up politics, if I'm allowed to say that, tends to be 45ers, as they call themselves, people who voted, who are not anti-British or don't want to be seen as nationalists. They're just fucking sick of Westminster. And fair dues. I think if I lived in Scotland, I'd be a 45er, not because I'm a nationalist. I'm quite the opposite. I'm a socialist. But I just don't see the point in Scotland or any other, Northern Ireland, certainly, I would like to see a united Ireland, 100%, without a doubt. No questions asked, just get out of Ireland, Britain. And I would like to see, you know, Wales have as much sort of, if you like, clout with, is it called the Barnet, isn't it called what's it called, the Barnet, the way they devolve the money? Is it called the Barnet?
Yeah, the Barnett formula. Yeah.
Formula. Thank you, Ian. Thanks for coming in and saving me. The Barnett formula. It seems to me that, you know, Wales have such a tiny voice, you know, really tiny voice. And nobody in Westminster cares much about the working classes in England, never mind the working classes in Scotland, Wales, and certainly Northern Ireland. You know, the truth is the working classes throughout have got more to unite each other. I mean, we should be working together. I get that. But I still believe if I lived in Scotland, I would be voting against Westminster. I'd be wanting out of whatever it is they're offering. And I do think, if I think of Scotland from a Londoner's point of view, and I realise that's a completely different lens, but from migrant parents, my parents were both born in Ireland, so economic migrants. But if I look at Scotland from that point of view, that lens, I just think Scotland has always produced great inventors, great ideas, some good football managers, and you know, some remarkable sort of brain, really. And it's also got all the terrain. It's huge. It's as big as England. We don't think of it in that way. It's got all that sea. It's got all that wind, all that mountain, and all that invention. I just think it could have been I don't know, it could have been a louder voice somehow. I know it probably economically couldn't have survived leaving the UK, particularly as, you know, we can see that it wanted to stay in Europe, but Europe have gone bizarrely right wing as well and probably wouldn't have helped them. I think they might have done once upon a time. I think there might have been a kind of argument that they had the right to keep sterling and all of the things that Scotland should have been able to do, keep sterling, stay in Europe and do all the things it wanted to do. But then you think staying in Europe, possibly, I don't know, in hindsight, you know, there's some huge problems there. So I think we're in such a complicated time. It's like a cauldron. It feels like the fall of Rome to me. I feel like we're all just being spiraled down in the fall of the American Empire. And Scotland's a tiny little voice in this, and it shouldn't be, because I think, you know, England and Englanders are in serious trouble because we're really just a money laundering oligarchy now. And I think Scotland would be well out of it if they had a way of surviving. That was my only, and I love Mary Black. I wanted to say that as well. I mean, again, her identity politics are things I would argue with in some ways, but I think the rest of her politics has been sound, absolutely amazing. I think Westminster will be sad to lose her, really. That's it.
Thank you, Trish. Thank you. I think we should take this opportunity and win to express our solidarity with you in your battles with the court system in London.
Thank you for saying that.
I'd like you to know that you have our full support and solidarity in this group.
That's lovely of you. It kind of crushed me, to be fair with you, Finn. You know, Roger will know, it's kind of crushed me. It silenced me.
Yes.
I lost my work. I've nearly lost where I'm living. But we've just managed to coast through, survive with great help from comrades who've offered financial help, which means that we haven't had to move. And to let you know some good news is I was told by the police as we were released under investigation a few weeks ago, which is kind of ominous, you know, forever kicking it down the road and frightening us. But we were told, I was told we would have hate crime arrest on my DBS, which would screw me in all of my work. But as it happens, I applied for my DBS and it took months to come through and it was stuck, because I don't know if any of you have done a sort of a DBS for yourselves, but you know, essentially done the adult safeguarding, the children's safeguarding, the list 99, all clear. And then it got to police, I think it said police report, and it was in progress for quite a long while. And I thought, oh, they're just going to hold it and let it whir. And they let it whir for a long time, but finally it came back clear. That shocked me. So I've secured a little bit of work now, which makes me feel a little less lost, a little more valuable and valued. People have come back to me a little that I can work with. I'm having to declare my situation. We've now got a bit of a comeback. Myself, Carell and Dave have now, through Netpol, have got some sort of plan of action with a statement. And we're asking people to write to the police to argue why they've done this to us and not just completely cleared us. I'm still keeping my last name off of the public stuff, purely because I just secured some work with Wigmore Hall and I start with a project in the spring, and that would be proper work with me with Interventure, and it's a really good opportunity and they know me. But the trouble is, and I know this might sound terrible, but whilst I was full, you know, I've got a clear DBS, I can carry on. I just was in an interview with them this week, Monday, and they showed me a film that they'd made, and one of their partners is Jewish Care. And I looked at that and said, well, a percentage of Jewish Care will be avid Zionists, a percentage, not all of them, but some of them will be, and it will screw me again. So I thought after that, oh shit, I better get my last name off of the public stuff, because I've got to work. Otherwise, because we rent here, I don't own a big property, I'm not secure. So, you know, I just think I'm just keeping myself, I'm looking out for myself a bit at the minute, because it's been a tough time. So thank you for your solidarity, and thanks for all the help you've offered. It's been really fantastic and heartwarming. And for Carell and Dave as well, I can speak on their behalf about this because they're not here today. But I think we're all feeling a little bit better that we've got a plan. And thank you for bringing it up, because it has crushed me somewhat and I'm only slowly re-emerging. And thank you. That's all.
Great, Trish. Yeah, well, good luck in your endeavours to avoid victimisation, which is obviously what's happening now.
Thank you very much.
Pam indicated you wanted to speak, Pam. Did I see your hand
So I
up
was
there?
just doing a thumbs up to Trish.
Can I just say a couple of things about Trish? First of all, she made some great points about Scotland that I could respond to in a minute. Before that, solidarity on your case. If you're worried about your second name, maybe, I don't know who's making up the video of this, if this last few minutes could be hived out, if that would be helpful. In terms of Jewish care, of course, in normal circumstances, you'd hope that people you have political disagreements with, you'd be providing as good a service to someone who did believe in Zionism as anybody else at work that you're caring for, and that you could have that disagreement. It might not ever even come up. Of course, some people would obviously try and use that in a different way against you, but I don't think there's any problem from your end, and from a regular care service users end who might have different political ideas on a range of things. But if we want to take maybe this section of the video down from the public thing, if that's helpful, I don't know. And just solidarity to you, Carol and Dave, of all the witch hunty things in the last period. It's one of the most absurd, if I remember the details right. Sorry,
can I just come back to you? And that's so kind of you. You're absolutely right. And in fact, my last job, I was supporting somebody who was someone who used my support directly and indirectly a lot. And he's somebody who's very much a pro-Israeli with property in Israel, and he always came back to me because I provided him support around dementia in his family without prejudice. Without prejudice, you're absolutely right. And he would still come back to me now, but he possibly wouldn't if he knew I was the one accused of anti-Semitism. So, you know, that's why, it's the atmosphere. It's not the reality, it's the atmosphere. People are forced into these bizarre cul-de-sacs of polarized opinion. You're absolutely right, but thank you very much. I don't think we need to hive off the end of this. My feeling is getting my name out in anything really, really public. I think amongst the left, people know it's me. They know it's Trish O'Hara amongst the left. I'm just hoping it doesn't get out there into Wigmore.
I saw your latest update on
okay, Trish, we need to get, I mean, good luck, but we need to get back to this question of Scotland. Pam, your hand was up again there, was it?
It's okay. I was just clarifying where Trish needs to be taken out. She doesn't spell.
Okay. No. Do other comrades wish to make, who haven't spoken, comrades wish to make a contribution or ask a question?
Would comrades mind if I go to the toilet just briefly?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, that's okay, Ian, of course. We'll make a note of whatever points that come up so we can direct them to Ian when it returns.
Don't need to take that out of the recording.
No, we'll just remind Ian what the question was when he comes back, if there is such a question. No, it's open to comrades to ask questions or to make additional contributions to a very relevant and current topic, Scotland. Yeah, I should remind comrades that we're not going to just kind of keep waiting, watching a silent screen. So if there are not, because it's difficult for comrades to kind of be patient if there's nothing being developed. So comrades have the opportunity to speak in, and hold on, and if not, then we'll go back to Ian and back to Matthew. Kieran, you're talking there, are you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Yes, I'm driving, so I'm on a motorway and I can't not drive, so it'll just be a short contribution. I couldn't make any notes, and I regret that because it is an interesting discussion and two interesting introductions. So thank you, Matthew and Ian. Both of you, identified as, I guess, left anti-nationalist, if you don't mind me saying that. And I find that refreshing, and I think that's the correct approach. It has troubled me over the last 20 years as, I can't remember, Matthew or Ian, one or other of you just outlined even the trajectory of people on the left who correctly orientated towards a mood in Scottish society amongst young people and amongst the working class, which lent into nationalism, became pro-independence because of the immature Bolshevism that we all recognize. It was a means and a way of expressing, their radicalism or their rebellion against the status quo, the hope that in an independent Scotland there would be a different type of society. All of that, we recognize the positive. But in doing so, I think a lot of the revolutionary left, they just lost their bearings. They lost their bearings entirely. They forgot to continue to point to what you two comrades pointed to, the proud traditions of the British Labour movement. And there is such a thing as the British Labour movement. The Welsh workers, Scottish workers, and English workers, and to an extent, workers in Northern Ireland linking up for positive reasons in Scotland against sectarian division, and in terms of the wider movement, all of the gains of the shop steward movement, for example, of the 1950s and the 1960s, in terms of wages, the movements in the factories. If we go back to the 1940s, the shared gain of the National Health Service, which is a creation of the British Labour movement together. And all of that was forgotten about. It wasn't in any of the material. And I think that was a major mistake. And now the tide has gone out in nationalism, and I think we could definitively say it has at this moment in time. The tide is going out. The idea that there might be a second referendum and a Scottish independence is essentially off the agenda for the next period. And the fact that that has happened, I think it gives the left an opportunity to reorientate. And this discussion is part of that, and the comrades' points, I think, were well made, and we need to think about where we should stand. And of course, we're in favour of self-determination of nations, national groups. Of course we are as Marxists. But there is a sense in which that's a tactical position as opposed to a principled position. So we know that the Bolsheviks, for example, didn't always stand for separation in all circumstances, and we shouldn't stand for separation in all circumstances. And let's postulate over the course of the next 10, 20 years, there's a resurgence of class consciousness and class struggle in these islands. In that context, do we argue for and do we put ourselves at the forefront of a move towards, of Welsh separation or Scottish separation, or do we put ourselves at the forefront of the opposite, which is about rebuilding a united class across these islands, across Ireland or England, Scotland, and Wales, and the move towards a socialist revolution across England, Scotland, and Wales, in which there will be maximum autonomy, including the possibility of independence for working class people. So we just change the axis. We change the axis away from what essentially was varieties of left nationalism from many of the left revolutionary groups, and we move away towards revolutionary socialism, with the acknowledgement within that the Scottish working class, the Welsh working class have the right to autonomy and to separation if they wish. Just the axis changes, and I think that's very, very important. I can understand why the militant was mentioned and the position of militant changed from the 1970s up to the present period. In the 1970s, at one point, comrades and militant were opposed to devolution, never mind independence and separation, and that position was changed in the late 1970s. Then the position changed again, as I think Matthew outlined, and that happened. So by the time of the referendum in 2014, the position was in favour of a yes vote, but a yes vote, but then continue the struggle for Scottish socialism within Scottish independence. And I think that was probably strategically, tactically the correct position. But if I'd been in Scotland, if I'd been politically active in Scotland at the time, I could imagine personally having argued for that position. But when it came to the ballot box, I'm not sure I could have voted for independence. I'm not sure I could, even though that had been strategic or tactically the right position to take, because of an aversion to the worst of nationalism, to the negative side of nationalism, which is often disguised but is always there. And it's there in Irish nationalism and it's there in Scottish nationalism, because nationalism ultimately can mean not just a rejection of national oppression, but it can also mean an assertion of national superiority. And I think that is there in Scottish nationalism, the sense that it's Scottish oil is our oil, that Scottish people in some way are better, or the Scottish working class are so much better.
Thank you, Kieran. We should note that both Ian and Matthew would have an opportunity to summarise or to comment finally on the points that are being raised. So this is your opportunity, other comrades who want to ask points here, which, as I say, both Matthew and Ian have a chance to deal with in the final summing up. So if comrades want to indicate, we can go to that point now. Okay. So, Matthew, do you want to speak first in the summing up part of this forum?
Yeah. Yeah, it's been useful. I think there's a few. I mean, in terms of the problem with Scottish nationalism, of course, is that what it does is it poses this notion that somehow the creation of a capitalist state in Scotland offers some solution to the working class, which it clearly doesn't. That's the issue with it. And it's actually about the organisation of the working class itself. You know, I mean, politically, the issue really is about, does the working class actually have its own organisation? Does it pose itself in terms of, an alternative, a political alternative to what's being done, neoliberalism, the drive to war, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what we've seen, obviously, is the actual instrument of that, the SNP, now accepting. I mean, before 2014, I mean, they actually accepted NATO as and so on. And if you look at the attitude of the SNP to the Americans, of course, is that one of slavish devotion, suitable for the likes of Starmer, has the same view. Some of the transcripts between the discussions between Sturgeon and the State Department are just embarrassing. But in those terms, I mean, ultimately the bottom of it is the question, right? Okay, you do have this, as I say, this shift in terms of the destruction of workers' organisation in Scotland, which has been huge. It's been massive, and in terms of the inadequacy of the politics and the political organisations and the trade union organisations that have been, historically have existed within Scotland when faced with that. And the question is, well, okay, how do we actually deal with that and propose something different and create organisations which are capable of taking on the situation, rather than just say, okay, well, what we're seeing is a political collapse into internationalism. By much of the left. I mean, the thing is, what is good in these terms, of course, is that, if you live in Glasgow as I do, it's an intensely political city. I mean, it's one of the very few places I've come across where you actually, you can find people on the street who will have a political debate with you at a reasonable level, because people are interested in politics. Anything is what they're being offered generally is pretty damn awful. And this is the issue, and it's more, in a way, more acute here because precisely of the state that's what's been reduced to. I think the other thing that comes out also is that the one struggle that's not actually been told is the struggle to organise the oil industry, which has been quite brutal and has gone over decades, and it's not really been written up. In those terms, and they have actually got, there are actually unions now involved on the North Sea, and so on, whatever, whatever criticism we make of them, and so on. But the fact that they exist has been a major thing. I think that also you're sitting with a situation where none of the political parties that will stand in election. This year or the Scottish elections in 2026 are really offering anything. Other than a continuation of what we got, which is basically more neoliberalism, more cuts, the destruction of public services. So in those terms, and you can see what happened in Scotland is a indicative of the same the rest of the country, in that, you know, you had a small move to the Labour Party, which was, there was, you know, some part of SNP vote. The SNP vote actually lost 500,000 votes because obviously people were disillusioned with it. The Labour Party gained some vote, not a huge amount. I mean, it's a bit more than happened in, say, England, but not hugely so. And you got a certain part of the more, you know, reactionary element went to reform. I mean, if you look at in Glasgow, actually, I think in some of the seats in Glasgow, the reform got considerably more votes than the Tories, because obviously people were, you know, even more disillusioned than the Tories. So what you're seeing is this sort of, you know, a political vacuum, which in many ways is quite dangerous, you know, because obviously the left is not actually offering anything viable at this point. I mean, you know, as I say, the last force we had, again, I mean, this is another issue really you need to go through, is the history of the SSP, which was capable of gaining, you know, a substantial vote among a section of the working class. Okay, on a, you know, a political program which had huge issues and huge problems, but presented itself as being a, you know, some kind of a, you know, socialist alternative led, you know, by people who'd been through the poll tax and so on and so forth. So, you know, you got like this, you know, a mass of the working class was then saying, well, okay, we'll vote for you, you know, which was then completely dissipated by the ridiculous, you know, shenanigans of Tommy Sheridan, etc., etc. And it's a major loss. I mean, you know, the great thing about being in the SSP actually was the ability to go on the street and you could talk to, you know, people, you know, of elements of the working class that you wouldn't normally ever get a chance to talk to, will come and talk to you because they thought you were interesting and serious, you know, and had something to offer. And, you know, so you could have all these interesting conversations on the street with people, you know, in those terms. And it was, you know, you could hold meetings and you got a hall full of people you'd never seen before. After the 2003 election, it was incredible in those terms, and it really a real missed opportunity in that sense. And so again, something we should draw some lessons from. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Now, Ian, it is some final winding up remarks you wish to make.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, some excellent points made by Trish and Kieran and Matthew. One, starting from the very end, on the SSP, one of my few disagreements with Matthew is I'd say it's more the ridiculous antics of the other side of that split against Tommy Sheridan going into the court supporting Murdoch. But I think, ironically, for the discussion this afternoon, I think maybe where that blow-up came out of more deeply was both sides of the SSP leadership, or what became the two sides. It was all in that group where they put Tommy up as their front man and became very jealous of him, but they were trying to work through the Scottish Parliament as the focus. They were trying to push a campaign for independence, which was at that point, and then for 10 years thereafter, actually not where the Scottish people were at, and ignoring like wider issues in terms of the anti-war movement and working class politics. Well, not ignoring, that's loose talk, but certainly well over prioritizing independence and constitutional issues at a time when that was a real sideshow, and that clique at Holyrood completely blew up. But I'm not sure if I'd say the SSP was the last real working class intervention, working class vehicle in Scottish politics that we've had. And I agree with Matthew, that's the really key question. I'd say it was, if not the Labour Party as a whole, because that was a site of struggle, then certainly the Corbyn wing within the Labour Party really did provide that for a brief period of a politics plugged into change across this island, but a working class revival in Scotland too. And the fact that it collapsed at the same time as COVID, at the same time as Boris Johnson seemed for a time to be having a 10-year new government. Of course, that came crashing down a lot sooner. did turbocharge independence, but it has been taken off the table now. One thing I meant to say and didn't have time for is the way it was taken off the table by the British state is unsupportable, I'd say, by us. But it did seem to work as well. That has to be acknowledged. That basically Sturgeon kept asking for a second referendum, and they kept saying no and stonewalling it and so on. The left, even left unionist position always was, let's have it out. There's a majority against independence, and if there was a second referendum that rejected independence again, that would have taken it off the table in a cleaner way. The way it has been taken off the table might leave a bad taste in people's mouths and store up problems for the future, because obviously the British state isn't a particularly democratic institution, and the way it's handled this isn't something that we'd support. But I totally agree with Trish about wanting to get away from Westminster, but what I'd always say about that is, what about the working class in England? They should be able to get away from Westminster in the way the state and the establishment down there carry on too, and that we should unite together to get Britain out of Westminster, as it were, rather than just Scotland. I do agree that Northern Ireland's a different issue, and that the reunification of Ireland and the end of that colonial cycle is a totally different thing from Scotland. That sort of feeds into the next point I'd like to make, and still in response to Trish about independence in Europe and how the EU itself has now gone in this increasingly far-right way. I think that's often exaggerated as well in European Parliament elections. So I think there's something about the structure of the EU where Britain kept returning right-wing populists who actually wanted out of Europe, but across the continent, votes within the EU institutions are often more right-wing than domestically, and certainly it's the way it pushed an agenda on Greece of austerity. Edinburgh was called the Athens of the North because of its role in the Scottish Enlightenment, and if we'd been trying to enter the euro and run a 3% surplus on the budget, we could have been the Athens of the North in a much less salubrious way too. But independence in Europe was initially about, I guess, independence being less of a break, because the assumption was that the rest of the UK would remain in the EU too, so there'd be no question of a hard border. There'd remain free movement between Scotland and England. One of the big objections to independence is that there's 1 million or so people on both sides of the border with family on the other side. So if there was a hard border, that would be a complete and utter disaster. And of course, Scotland can say, the SNP can say, we don't want to impose a hard border, but of course you'd be negotiating probably with the Tories, and they just might, so it's not something worth risking that 1 million or 2 working class people can't even visit their family without getting a visa. And of course, independence in Europe then became about us being in Europe while England was not, which of course was the big risk of that. In terms of Ireland, it's certainly EU membership to an extent lubricated the peace process, and Brexit has sped up the next stage of reunification. But that's because Northern Ireland has somewhere to go to. And the Republic of Ireland already has free movement separate from Europe with the rest of the UK. So that with the UK, so that's again different from this kind of implosion model of independence, that implosion and yet keeping everything else the same around it. It was a very anti-working class mix of conservatism and catastrophism, if you looked at it too closely. I mean, if we had a federation of Europe or a socialist United States of Europe, I might be up for Scotland upgrading to full member rather than an autonomous region of the UK Republic, but that's 1 million miles from where we are right now. Mary Black, Trish mentioned in the chat and in our introduction, along with likes of Tommy Shepherd. That's someone I did think of in the longer form of my remarks as another example of that. I do know some socialist drummers, her seat, who don't believe all the hype about her, but it's undeniable she made very good interventions at Westminster, and to an extent that early SNP 2015 intake, treating it like a foreign parliament, much more irreverent to it. That was all to the good to shake things up. The trouble is up the road in Holyrood, where they're the ascendancy. In some ways, it's just like a more boring, less traditional, as it were, more managerial, neoliberal, modernist version of Westminster. And that kind of middle-class managerialism, or a new country in the way that the Baltics and Balkans are new countries, isn't anything that the working class should be invested in. It's a different project altogether. Sorry, I had one last thing that I wanted to say. Oh yeah, the Green Party. That's one thing that I did want to touch on. If I've got a couple of minutes left, I will. The way that they pulled the rug out from Humza Yousaf was quite revealing. That they had the casting vote, so there was a pro-independence majority because they're pro-independence. The SNP were somewhat short of a majority. They had 5 MSPs, so they went into coalition with the SNP, even though they'd already had they'd been the same parliamentary arithmetic for 5 years before, and they didn't have to go into coalition. They exerted some pressure from outside and had a bit more influence, but in the end, their 2 co-leaders took up 2 junior ministerial positions. So from my way of looking at it, it was almost like the most impressive result that they could get in that way, humiliating result they could get. Of course, there's some things you can do with executive power, they'd argue, working from within, but their own membership eventually wanted out. Humza Yousaf then got ahead of the curve and sacked them. But what they were saying to Humza was, we have to have a consultation, or they conceded to their membership that they could come out of the coalition if the membership voted for it, but it was going to be a 1 month long postal ballot rather than the more old school but also more working class tradition of have a special conference at the weekend, hash it all out, might be blood on the floor, metaphorically speaking, but work it out instead of putting them on notice that we'll let you know what the composition of the government will be in a month's time, in this kind of more modern middle class way that parties in this kind of post Thatcher epoch sort of do. So yeah, they then got Humza's scalp, which sort of saved their own leaders at that time from coming under any more serious scrutiny and being forced out. Whether that will be a particular advantage at the election, that Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater will probably still be leading the Greens into the election is less clear, but certainly they got Humza's scalp to maybe save their own. But I think it's also illustrative of the ways in which the Greens sociologically and politically aren't really the answer, and that a Labour movement revival of in politics post Corbyn is sorely needed, because I've not listed the Lib Dems. There's not really much worth saying about them, but all the parties currently in Parliament will be in a weaker position than they were 5 years ago, and even in a way that we don't particularly approve of, the independence as an immediate question has been taken off the table, which does give us a chance to get on with more important politics of working class representation, of opposition to wars, which is increasingly important issue in the last few years, and must be likely going on into the next few. Yeah, and hopefully linking up across the UK with what's happening in England is currently ahead of Scotland, and that they've got 5 pro-Gaza protest votes, including Jeremy Corbyn elected into Westminster, and hopefully between that and the other parties that are coming up, some political alternative to Starmer can emerge out of that. And in Scotland, where the Labour Party was never quite as big, never as remotely as big in terms of the Corbyn surge, because it came months after the pro-independence surge, for one thing. And I was actually an anomaly from my points of order at UK conference, probably put a target on my back to get me kicked out, because usually we needed everyone we could get against the nationalists. Now I don't know, maybe they'll feel able to extend that witch hunt up here, but there are still some good people in the Labour Party up in Scotland, just as I'm sure there are across the UK. But in terms of providing any kind of alternative, I think for the foreseeable that boat sailed, but with PR and hopefully some new party being brought together by then, I think there's actually a big political vacuum. And as Matthew says, the stakes are quite high, because it's not just the left that could fill that with the rise of reform. So there were like paper candidates whose some actually surmise that they might not even be resident on Earth, let alone in Scotland. And some of these seats, people who'd never been heard of and were very difficult to track down. And the PO box was somewhere that the locals knew it had nothing to do with reform, and yet they got more votes than the Tories, more votes than the organised left, and so on, or the not so organised left. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think it's interesting times in Scotland. We've rejoined UK politics at a time when UK politics itself has, one could say, never been worse, is certainly in a state of flux. And at least we've got off Nicola Sturgeon's hamster wheel. So let's make the most of being off the hamster wheel for so long as we're off of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. I'd like to once again thank both Matthew and Ian for their informative and interesting and lots of stimulating ideas in their contribution. So thanks again for that. We appreciate the contribution and the final summing up points you've made as well. To talk about next week, I don't know whether it's going to be Jimmy or Roger, but next week's meeting, which I believe is going to be about Palestine. Is that correct? Roger? You're muted, Roger. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the next 2 meetings are going to be on probably the 2 most crucial issues in the world today. The next meeting is on Palestine and the Gaza war. And we have a comrade who's an expert who has visited the region many times, and I think it will give us a real insight into the situation and the perspectives for that horrific genocidal war which is taking place at the present time. Of course, not only in Gaza but in Lebanon and maybe in Iran in not too distant future. And the following week will be just a couple of days after the presidential election in the USA, and we'll have a number of American comrades who'll be there commenting with the news and with their instant reactions to the outcome of that election, which whoever wins is going to be probably a complete turning point in US and even maybe world politics. So I hope that all the comrades will come and tell all your friends and tell your comrades, because really it will be worth getting a mass turnout for those two discussions. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Roger. So once again, I want to thank the comrades for their contributions, thank the comrades for their attendance, and we'll conclude the meeting at this point. So have a good evening. Slán go léir agus tá go mé í hamá go Slán.